So here we are. Hello. This is the latest podcast from the Discover Plus podcast team here in Cornwall. And I'm Theo Blackmore. I'm kind of the podcast at the moment, or one of the podcast team. And today I'm talking to
Rebecca Tayler Edwards
brilliant.
At Disability Rights UK.
Thank you very much. So I want to talk to you today, Rebecca, because we've worked together a bit past year or so, and that's in relation to your work that you're doing with disabled people's organisations. So I don't know if you could perhaps just explain a bit about what your role is at Disability Rights UK.
Yeah, for sure. Before I pop in, Theo, I just want to say that my pronouns are she, her for anyone who wants to contact me in the future. And I'm the DPO Development Manager at Disability Rights UK, which is a new post. I came in September, and I can't believe it's been the best part of a year already. But this work is quite broad in scope, but in essence, it's designed to break down the barriers to the disabled people's organisation sector, and all the wonderful grassroots groups, the larger DPO organisations that exist within it. It's co-productive by design, so it's very much me sitting amongst multiple DPOs, of which you, Theo, you sit on the steering board for, working together to see how we can break down the barriers to the sector's development, and also build capacity within lots of DPOs generally. So how we can boost the sort of productivity, how we can make it more inclusive and accessible, and also help organisations that have been struggling quite substantially since the pandemic, which of course, Theo, you spoke about in your research as well.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic was an amazing thing, wasn't it? It was, it really hit the disabled people's organisations very hard. So we're talking in acronyms a little bit, but the acronym DPO stands for Disabled People's Organisations.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting term with some variation amongst different organisations that it represents. Some groups go by DDPO, which means Deaf and Disabled People's Organisations. Some define themselves as service user-led groups. Others don't really define themselves with a sort of acronym or a standard definition. They're just led by disabled people. And a lot of groups that exist really in intersectional forms of marginalisation. So they represent being individuals with lived experience of disability, but other forms of protected characteristics in the UK. And they exist quite wholly in themselves. I'm not disabled and queer, I'm a disabled queer organisation. So they don't define themselves as DPOs, but we include them and we work with them because they are led by disabled people. For those of you who don't really know about how you can define yourself as that, at Disability Rights UK, we recognise a DPO as a group that is led around 50% of your workforce at a minimum by disabled people and people with lived experience of disability. And your board has to be 75% of individuals who identify as disabled. If you have a board, some groups aren't charities, so they don't have a board. And the only other sort of defining feature is that you work for the progression of the disability movement, and you work in accordance to the social model of disability. So that's really, in essence, I mean, Theo, you could break down that definition better than I could, but you're working to break down societally based disablement, and why in society we have disabled individuals, and that's in sort of opposition to any sort of medical model. And the medical model would say, well, it's actually about the individual. And other organisations in the disability movement have been quite instrumental in arguing against that over the years.
Yeah, I mean, the social model of disability sort of came about starting from the 1970s, didn't it?
Yeah.
There's an organisation called the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, or UPIAS, and they wrote something called the Fundamental Principles of Disability. And in fact, I was talking to a disabled people's organisation, Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People, and they've got a disability archive there.
Wow.
And I said to them, what sort of stuff have you got? And they've got a load of stuff. And I can't remember the exact amount. I said, how do you quantify the amount of stuff you've got? And they said, well, when you're quantifying archives, you quantify it in length. And they've got 110 meters of archive. And so that's everything laid down on the floor, left you laid it out.
That must have taken a while.
It might be more than that. I think it might be more like 1,000 meters. But anyway, and I said, have you got any fundamental principles of disability? And they said, yeah, we've got 7 copies. So, you know, there's a few of them floating about still. And it's a really important document.
You know what, Theo, I'd love to whiz round there and take a look at it. I mean, this is something we've talked about before, but, you know, I myself am 24. I'm fairly new to the DPO space. I've been disabled for 6 years now. And as a young person who acquired many of my conditions later in life, well, some will define that as early in life. You know, we've talked about the difference between the young generation of disabled people and the sort of the history that came before us and the disconnection. And what I would love, and I think a lot of young disabled people would love, is to create more space to connect that sort of the history and the future of the movement together a little bit more. So yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting space to be in. I'd love to see those archives.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting space, like you say. So it's important for younger disabled people, I think. I'm an older disabled person, so I'm 56. So for those of you who are listening on a podcast rather than looking on a YouTube, I'm sitting here, no hair, you know, long at the chin. But anyway, it's you know, it's for me, it's something which is a bit of the lived experience of my life, because I got involved in the disability movement back in the 1990s. So I've kind of got a long track record. So I've kind of been in it for a very long time. But for people like yourself, younger people coming in and getting involved, there is a lot of stuff to find out about. You know, it's silly to keep on reinventing stuff over and over again. So to understand the social model and the struggles that we all went through in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, you know, it's something which I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think it's integral to the progression of the movement as well, Theo. You know, we was actually talking about this at Disability Rights this morning before we recorded this, about the importance of connecting with the younger movement. And I mean, on one stage, it's because a lot of the younger generation of the disability movement are quite adamant, as they should be, in their sort of demands for human rights. And what they're doing in many respects is trying a lot of the things that were started out and attempted in the 70s and the 80s. And, you know, on one hand, there's a lot to be learned from the older generation who did that work before. And they can say, well, we tried this. These were the methods that were effective to progress the movement. This didn't work out for us, but maybe it only didn't work out for us at that time because of the sort of zeitgeist of the society. So maybe you could try it this way now in 2023 going onwards. And it's also quite important, you know, we don't want to leave disabled people behind as, you know, our language progresses and we're coming up with all of these incredibly and, you know, much needed terms, but not always accessible to the older generation who don't use TikTok or Twitter or whatever, you know, to bring them along with us as well, because, well, fundamentally because they're part of the movement too.
Yeah, you know, I think it's really important, this idea about understanding what's been before. So like the social model of disability, which, you know, was developed when it was in those circumstances by that group of people, if only so that the younger generation can then grow from that or ignore it or make decisions about it. You know what I mean? It's about,
yeah, absolutely.
There's an evolutionary process, isn't there? And so I don't think as a model, the social model is something which will be ignored. I think it's a really valid piece of work. But I do think that there are new directions to go in, and all this stuff you're mentioning, TikTok there and all the different ways, this newfangled modern stuff that's all coming out and about, you know, there's a load of stuff that could be used and could be done to develop the organizations and the movements in different ways. Yeah,
absolutely. And if it helps to anyone, I still can't understand TikTok too much. So you know, you're not alone out there. And I think, you know, this potentially goes into a little bit of my research, which we could just discuss, Theo. But, you know, one of the most interesting findings from my research, in my opinion, was when I was just talking to people who had been in the space for a while, and we were discussing their experiences of conflict within the movement as well as the DPO sector. And their arguments was, well, it's difficult, conflict is difficult, but it has been the backbone of progressing the movement going forward. We have to dispute with each other about how progressive and inclusive our stances are. Otherwise, we can't be more progressive and more inclusive. So yeah, I think there's scope for other people in the disability movement to say, actually, no, the social model of disability isn't inclusive enough, it isn't radical enough. It isn't taking the movement in the direction it needs to be to make, long-term change. And that should be done. We should create more spaces, in my opinion, to debate among each other. But the capacity of the DPO sector is fairly limited. So the challenge is, how do we do that as well as keep our organisations alive and running so successfully?
That leads neatly onto your research. You did a massive bit of research, didn't you? I mean, you've been in post since September. So how many months is that? It's like 9 or 10 months or something.
Yeah. And gone so quickly.
You did a massive piece of work.
I did. I mean, I suppose it helps that I came into post right after my master's. So I was already in that research mode.
So what was your master's in?
Carry it on. I did my master's in global health and development. So somewhat different, but I see a lot of correlation in between the health space and the disability space. But that's another conversation going forward. But my research into the DPO sector was a 4-month mixed method analysis. So to de-jargon a little bit, mixed methods means that you use both quantitative data, that's numbers, and qualitative data, so that's talking to people and sort of gathering their experiences. I was very open in design. There was a sort of the harrowed focus of being specifically on development and specifically of the experiences of the DPO sector, but it had a lot of insights into the disability movement overall. We interviewed around 32 DPOs. We also interviewed around 6 voluntary sector organisations that weren't DPOs to get a sort of understanding of the comparison between the voluntary sector at large and the DPO sector. And I believe there was about 61 participants with around 37 to 40 interviews and focus groups. So an interview was to de-jargon a little bit more, was to just sit down with people and say, this is what we want to do. What do you think of it? It was very open in design. And we let DPOs and representatives of DPOs, usually the directors and CEOs of the organization, to speak on their experiences of the organization, how it's set up, what does it do, what is their experience of development. And the focus groups did the same sort of thing. Some interviews had follow-ups with interested DPOs. And then what I did with all that information was, well, when I collected a large body of notes, which has backed up my computer forever, but I conducted what is called a thematic analysis on that qualitative data. To de-jargon, the science space is filled with lots of terminology that is actually quite simple in its definition, but why we have so much jargon is beyond me. Thematic analysis is, in its simplest form, looking at the transcripts and the quotes and mainly my notes over and over again to understand what was popping up over again. So for example, if people was talking a lot about relationships, I would create a theme called relationships, and underneath that theme you could break it down a little bit more into a subordinate theme. So what types of relationships are important and how the relationships function. That's almost as specific of it. So overall, I found around 17 themes. So themes are, what did people talk about the most, not what's the most important, but really what was most popular. And then I huddled them together into 4 quarters. If those of you who want to read my research, I de-jargon it a lot in the sort of glossary section, but those sorts of 4 quarters are also called overarching themes. And that's sort of, what are all the sort of topics of conversation indicating? So if I could, Theo, I'll break down a little bit into what I found.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And then we can talk about it a little bit more. So I'll give an overarching view, because the research is freely available and should be published on the Disability Rights UK website. If any other DPO also wants to pop that on their website as well, that's freely available. And you can get in contact with me beforehand if you want the Word document. But overall, the sort of biggest quarter that I looked at was labeled the DPO ecosystem. So this is looking at what is the relationships and connectivity, the inclusivity of the DPO space looking like. Overall, it was defined by the fact that the disability movement in the DPO space was quite individual in its sort of setup in comparison to, you know, the marketing sector or the sales sector, in that we care a lot about what we do. You know, that we talk a lot in human rights about the personal being political. This is a political space, but it is deeply personal. It is led by individuals who are quite literally the first in line when it comes to being at the forefront of the policy changes by government or disablement by society. We experience that every day, so we're affected by it, and therefore everything we do in the sector is deeply personable. So all the connections and relationships and networking, which would be probably how you define it in another sector, is personal relationships, because we care a lot about what we do. And it also defines how we've moved generally. It's been quite a sort of grassroots sector by nature. We've all done this together over the years, and then we created organizations to survive. This theme really looked at how those connectivities survive. So because we're such a deeply personable sector, our relationships are how we survive. It's how we tell each other about what funding is available or what opportunities can come up, or, you know what, I'm doing this in this space over in Kent. Can you do this over here? Because I think it would be really impactful for the disabled community over there. But unfortunately, over the years, because DPO's capacity has been limited increasingly, even more so after the pandemic, due to limited funding in the sector, which gets talked about quite a lot across the report, our ability to connect with each other is quite difficult. And so the challenge here is, how can the DPO capacity building project and other organizations who want to work in DPO capacity building really focus on promoting the connectivity of the sector? Sorry, I've got
the thing that struck me most, I think, from when I did that bit of work, you know, during the pandemic, was just that lack of connectivity between DPOs. So it's really difficult, you know, anyway, it's difficult full stop anyway, because my DPO is down here in Cornwall and we're in the far southwest, so the nearest one is in Devon. That's already 100 miles away. So if we want to talk to somebody up in Yorkshire or somebody over in London, you know, that's just like a phenomenal distance. It's getting easier now because of the internet, but there was no kind of internal structures there to facilitate that, or no space within there to make that happen.
Yeah, and connecting the sector digitally or in any sort of way is a big piece of work. I mean, it's something that's becoming a third of the project going forward, rightfully so. It's necessary, but it carries a lot of challenges in terms of inclusivity and the digital divide. Not all individuals who run a DPO have access to the internet or can use sort of complicated web designs with ease. This theme also looked at inclusivity quite a lot, and the inclusivity of DPOs that worked in impairment specific challenges that tend to be marginalized within the disability space in general. So for example, mental health doesn't always appear at the forefront of the disability movement's demands. And so DPOs that worked in mental health felt like lots of their challenges were marginalized, and as a result, they didn't get told about the funding opportunities and the projects and everything that was going on that keeps us alive. In the same way, organizations that were intersectional, so those groups that worked in for example, anti-racism as well as disability at the same time, they also had the same experiences because they felt that intersectional understandings of disability was often marginalized. So how can we do this work to connect to the sector, but also do so in a way that is more inclusive and brings more DPOs in and more groups in without sort of being quite harsh and marginalizing in the way in which we function?
Yeah, I mean, it's that thing about being as inclusive as possible to as many people as possible, isn't it? And those groups you talk about, you know, so groups that work specifically with specific groups of disabled people, is particularly in intersectional spaces, there are so few of those organizations around, you know. So it's really difficult for someone down here in Cornwall again to get in touch with a specific DPO that's going to understand more about what their needs are. So they will get in contact with our DPO, and our DPO then has to be skilled up to be able to meet those challenges and to meet those needs of those people. Yeah,
Yeah, and what I've found as well, Theo, is that some of these organizations are quite used to being dismissed within the disability movement generally, because of the fact that what they do and the way they work is marginalized. So, you know, the challenge now is when we want to get in contact with them and we want to say, you know, we want to make this space more inclusive, they have their guards up, rightfully so. I would be the exact same way. And so connecting with them in even the sort of traditional email way is becoming quite challenging. And it also comes with the sort of demand to boost the rest of the DPOs and being more inclusive. You know, it's all well and good for, you know, Disability Cornwall and Disability Rights UK, who are, you know, we've talked about this before, we're both engaging in being more intersectional by design, more inclusive by design. But there are lots of DPOs who don't really know much about intersectionality or inclusion, probably because a lot of these conversations are in spaces that they themselves are marginalized from, places like academia, the internet, you know, TikTok, social media. So there's a lot of marginalization from lots of ends that has to be broken down in order for us to be more inclusive. It's very structural, unfortunately, as well as interpersonal.
Yeah, and you know, like you say, there's a lot of people who might even be wary of coming to some organizations because they've got previous experience at other organizations or with other groups of people who haven't been as welcoming. You know, I remember talking to somebody years ago now, and he said, how do I describe myself? Am I a white male wheelchair using gay man, or am I a gay white male? You know what I mean? So it depends on which order you put all your words in as well. So it's how you label yourself. It's like, and then you find that they're not particularly welcome in one sector, but they are finally welcome in another sector, or they're not. You know what I mean? It's like the intersectionality of all of it is really quite difficult to unpack.
Yeah, and the reality is that there's lots of people who don't just exist in two intersections, they exist in a plethora. I mean, the definition is useful. It's opened doors for many people to sort of broaden their experience of a very holistic marginalization from multiple places, but intersectionality can be quite vertical in general. You know, it doesn't completely, you know, express the whole human experience. So even just defining what these organizations are, who these people are, you know, I've myself experienced lots of challenges in defining myself, and being very sensitive to that and listening rather than talking for these people and these organizations, I think is key here. You know, I spoke to a few people internally as well as Disability Cornwall on how we can create more spaces for intersectional DPOs. And it comes down to also the definition of an intersectional DPO, whether we should be titling it that, because it then puts disability first. And a lot of people experience that holistically instead of I'm disabled and.
Yeah. And so you're talking about your research.
Yes, we've gone off on a
if I'm wrong, but I think you might have just covered one of the quarters.
I did, yeah. So maybe I'll keep it a little brief with the other ones for the sake of time. But if anyone does want to get in contact with me, and I can break down that research more, and there's also free access to the report. So the second quarter of the sector was called Survival in a Turbulent Climate, and this particularly looked at the operational withstanding of the DPO sector overall, but also, you know, looking at them individually, specifically post COVID-19. So it's looking at a climate where in the middle of lockdown, where a lot of organizations, and importantly funding organizations and the local government, were strikingly aware of the impacts of the pandemic, let loose quite a lot of emergency fundings. And this was brilliant. It allowed a lot of these organizations to survive. But as a result, a lot of these funding organizations have emptied their reserves. They don't have anything left. And the government is also talking about their experience in the same way. So there isn't much left for DPOs in 2023 to sort of access, despite the fact that disabled people still need a lot of service use. You know, they still need our organizations to be running at a speed and a capacity larger than before the pandemic, because, you know, our needs haven't gone away. The marginalization of our communities haven't gone away. It's become worse during the pandemic. You know, a lot of us aren't wearing masks anymore, but there's still long-term impacts of the pandemic, as well as a lot of people from COVID-19 developing, long-term illnesses like long COVID as well. So we have more disabled people that we want to represent in either our campaigning or services rather.
There's also still people catching COVID, you know, we know
there's still people catching COVID, yeah.
A lot of disabled people are still isolating and are still keeping themselves away from, and still need, you know, medicines delivered, food delivered, and a lot of the stuff that DPOs did during the pandemic, they still need that to be happening.
They still need it now, but the problem is now that DPOs can't do it to the capacity that they did because they don't have the funding anymore. The emergency fundings are completely gone. So how do these DPOs survive? This specifically looked at the sort of financial situation, and this is where the quantitative data came into it. It sort of looked at how much money in reserves the DPOs had. Not all DPOs in the UK. We looked at the Charity Commission's reporting. So not all organisations define themselves as a DPO on the Charity Commission. In fact, the Charity Commission doesn't have a section where you can define yourself as a DPO. We had to cross-check that internally. But it sort of, in summary, found that, you know, the financial situation for a lot of DPOs is worse post the pandemic, which could be expected. We did find quite a wide range in the experiences of DPO. So some of the larger ones seemed to be doing reasonably well, hitting all their sort of financial targets, but the smaller DPOs, as expected, were struggling a lot more. And in my qual analysis, so talking about the conversations with organisations, we discussed the fact that a lot of DPOs are thinking about moving outside the charity and funding model to survive, whether they want to explore becoming CICs, as well as the way in which the funding system is set up, not in favour of disabled people's organisations, but really in favour of large charities and global or national organisations that represent, or well, don't represent disabled people in their body and makeup, but talk about disability a lot. And so those organisations that are quite large have the money to apply for a funding manager, whereas a lot of smaller DPOs don't do that. That's usually the CEO or you know, anyone who runs a project at the time has to do it within the capacity that they do. And so the funding system, even on top of that, is quite challenging for DPOs. You know, the language that the funders use, the way in which the system is set up, a lot of DPOs found it to be quite ableist in its design and not particularly inclusive of the reasonable adjustments that a lot of DPOs need being ran by disabled people themselves. So that was that theme.
And just quickly in passing, just to unpack, you said a lot of DPOs are becoming CICs. The CIC is a charity incorporated company?
Yeah, so they're exploring becoming CICs. I haven't got any evidence
CIC stand
actually becoming. I don't know what it stands for, unfortunately.
Incorporated, something incorporated, charity incorporated, something like that.
Yeah, but in essence, it means an organization that sort of brings in their own revenue and doesn't rely on funders. I don't know the exact breakdown, but
community interest company, I remember that.
Community interest company. Yeah, that is it for sure. And they're also exploring, you know, different ways in which they can bring in revenue in a for-profit sort of sense outside of the charity model. And, you know, it speaks to the DPO space in general, the fact that we've been very responsive and always explored ways of being flexible to survive. And this is just another example of it. We're exploring ways of moving outside of the funding model. DPOs also talked about the sort of ways in which that could liberate them. In essence, you know, some organizations rely on local government tenders and funding to survive. Long-term funding doesn't exist as frequently as it used to, but short-term funding does, which means that a lot of DPOs don't really have the time, space, or ability to be quite progressive and argumentative with government policies. Because if I want to, you know, pick up the next tender that my local authority is going to give out, I'm not really in a sort of political position that I can argue with some of the policies that they're releasing currently, because I can't create a sort of poor relationship with them, because we need this tender funding to survive as an organization. And it's quite a difficult position to be in, to be the sort of voice of disabled people, but also relying on the government to carry on the work that we do.
Can't bite the hand that feeds you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the whole thing about the whole sort of having a funding manager, like you say, you know, some of the bigger charities, they all have funding managers. It's really difficult to find a funder to fund a funding manager.
Yeah.
It's a really difficult one to find.
I
So
think verbatim, I heard that sentence about 3 or 4 times in my research, and also, core funding grants is quite a difficult thing to fund for. Position grants is quite hard to fund for. A lot of funders purely, in their sort of strategy, care a lot about vertical programs, which doesn't ultimately serve the disability movement too much. It's a holistic, horizontal challenge to break down disablement in society. It's not going to be fixed with 3 or 4 programs, but that's the model that we survive on.
yeah, short-term project funding, that's where it all goes.
Yeah.
What that means is that our organizations, what happens is we have a size, and then you might get a bit of funding to do a project, and so your organization grows to meet that, and then suddenly the funding finishes after 3 years and it goes back to a different size again, and then you lose staff, you're losing skills, you're losing, you lose capacity, but you just lose such a lot of knowledge.
Yeah. And staffing was a particularly prominent theme in this sort of third quarter about internal capacity and resourcing. It looked at the challenges of DPOs in maintaining, retaining, and also recruiting highly skilled disabled people. The challenge being, just like you said, they have to let people go if they don't have another project to put them on. And those individuals, being disabled people, are now going to be without employment. So it poses a sort of societal challenge, but also they carry a lot of skills that we need to survive as a DPO. They carry experience in the sector, and recruitment costs money. So 2 or 3 years down the line, where we have the money for another project, we have to then invest more in recruiting another person, and that money could have gone directly to the work that we do regularly. DPOs in this regard also talked about struggling to hire young disabled people as well. This generally speaks to what we were talking about earlier about the sort of separation between young disabled people and the DPO space. I've spoken to a few younger people, and they've said, quite plainly, I didn't even know that the disabled people's organization space existed. I didn't know that there was an entire sector dedicated to our rights. And so as a result, we don't really get many new recruits who are skilled in the sort of things that are needed in today's day and age, like evidence and evaluation, how to demonstrate impact. Those things are being taught at the moment to the younger generation, who want to work in the sort of progression of our rights, but don't even know that we exist. So a lot of my work now is to sort of connect the younger people with the movement going forward. And that's quite an optimistic place to be in. But on the other end, in terms of resourcing and capacity building, data came up a lot. We exist in a world where you have to show, either in your campaigning or in funding applications, quite rigorous evidence, across multiple years with large populations that DPOs don't have the capacity to take, in comparison to larger charities. And so our sort of perspectives on policies or funding services are not often taken as sort of rigorous and at the level of expertise that we can actually offer, because we don't have the capacity to do empirical data collection. And this theme talked a lot about similar sort of areas of resourcing that's quite challenging for DPOs, but quite purely because of our limited capacity to maintain it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing that comes up over and over and over again, isn't it? The whole thing about capacity.
Yeah.
Longevity, the sector, we've been going now since the 1970s, so getting on for 40 or 50 years, which is quite a long time, but it's still a really new sector, and it's still a really new thing. This whole sort of it's quite an amazing thing. We need to build capacity so that we can get that sort of knowledge going, and which spans generations, so that we can get younger people involved. And the whole thing about younger people as well, so there's an issue around, a lot of the people in the sector are getting older, and so will naturally retire and move on from their jobs, and so you want to be having younger people coming in to fill your roles as you're moving on. So you need to be doing that mentoring. That mentoring work is something which we really don't have capacity for.
Yeah, and it takes time to organize mentoring, but it's quite a fulfilling process. In many cases, mentoring and internships leads to identifying people who could be your future employees and the future leaders of your organization, but it takes a lot of work. And what I'm trying to do at the moment is really identify exactly what's needed from organizations like Disability Rights UK, but also academic institutions, what we can ask of them to push more people to be mentored by the sort of experienced DPOs and chairmans. And I think it's quite an exciting prospect because it allows us to progress as a movement and survive as organisations. It faces an expiry if we can't continue the movement going forwards. But the challenge is to do so in a way that doesn't demand more of DPOs that don't have the capacity to take on another intern if they're doing it all themselves. Interesting space though.
And so that's 3 of the 4 sectors. Is there a 4th one?
Yeah, there is. And this one's potentially the most surprising. It was something that I didn't anticipate coming into this role, but quite frequently, quite literally a quarter of the time, the DPOs talked about the sort of general broader space in which the DPO sector operates in. And this is something that I've touched on in other areas. There's a lot of fluidity between these quarters. And it's also, if you work at a DPO, you're very much aware of it. But it's the sort of socio-economic and political sphere that we work in and how it imposes barriers on the survival of DPOs. It's called The Sector and Its Barriers. And it looks at the sector as sort of a complete whole within a sort of the society of the UK specifically that we work in. It tackles different areas. So the first being the sort of funding, accreditation and government challenges. So this touches on the funding piece a little bit about the fact that not enough funders are particularly inclusive of disabled people who write applications for different tenders in their design or sort of providing reasonable adjustments, etc. But it also takes into consideration the fact that not a sufficient amount of local authority communities or funders or accreditors prioritize disabled-led or service user-led groups. This is a challenge within the disability movement quite broadly. You know, the fact that generally we're not considered to be the experts in leading our own causes. I've worked in multiple areas of human rights, and it would be particularly improbable of me to work for an anti-racist group that was led by people who weren't people of colour. It would be improbable. But by converse, in the disability space, it's very prominent for organisations to work in disability but are not led by disabled people.
Isn't that amazing? Is that not amazing?
Yeah.
I do find it amazing. This is something which I just can't get my head around at all.
Yeah, and it's quite outraging, actually.
I wouldn't work for a women's organisation if I was a bloke. You wouldn't work for a man's organisation if you're a woman. You wouldn't, you know, it's just, hang on a minute. How come we've got non-disabled people representing us and telling us what it is that we need?
Yeah, and representing us in very large spaces with a lot of financial backing and a lot of recognition among government and in media spaces as well. And I think that's the biggest challenge here, is why overall as a society we're so eager to accept us as disabled people not being represented by ourselves. Why is it seen as okay that you know, carers and parents and family members speak for us instead of ourselves? Where is our voice in our own space? You know, we talk about it in the disability movement, I think, about us without us, but so frequently our conversations about us led by people who are not us, and that's represented in the barriers that are experienced by DPOs. You know, Lloyd's quite recently put out a dedicated funding stream for disabled people's organisations, and this is particularly the first of its kind. The Together Fund at Disability Rights UK does that, or did that rather. It's coming to a close, but you know, other funders don't do this. They don't lead service user led work. In general, you know, from what I know, is that it's not too common in other human rights spaces when it comes to funders as well. So this is a systemic problem. And this is true in local authority as well. You know, a lot of challenges that we're having is to talk to MPs and policymakers in a way in which we're respected as experts in our own right on disability. And this just isn't considered. We're considered as charity organisations who care a lot about the cause, but not actual experts and consultants on disability. And it's quite problematic. It's also present in academia. You know, the work in which you do at the moment, Theo, in the academic space is also the first of its kind when it comes to projects ran by disabled people that is writing about disability. And so this poses real systemic barriers to the sector and requires quite a political move on organisations like Disability Rights UK, who want to do capacity building to urge in a lobbying work and campaigning work and promotional work the expertise and deserved expertise of the disability space, disabled people's organisations quite specifically. And it also talks about the challenges in the same sort of political space of organisations that work outside of campaigning. So for those of you who don't know too much about the DPO sector, we're pretty varied in the way in which we act. Some organisations work in campaigning and some organisations work in a lot of service delivery. It's just the way in which they were set up or changed over time to survive in the UK. But organisations that specifically work in service delivery don't particularly have time to partake in national political campaigns. And although they have a voice and they really want to talk about the local policy that's going on, again, I touched on this before, it comes down to policy issues about, speaking against the local authority. But even in the absence of that, DPOs don't have the capacity to go on a Twitter storm or to head down to Parliament to sort of protest. So how can we support organisations in uplifting their political voice despite the very limited capacity to do so, but also quite importantly do so in a way that is co-produced and that is not speaking for DPOs, and really sort of letting them define how and which way we act in putting a microphone in front of them.
And so it's a space really for Disability Rights UK, isn't it? There is a space there. So we all think that we know. So there's lots of big charities, lots of big disability charities that have incomes of tens of millions and hundreds of millions of pounds. And we all know that. And Disability Rights UK gets lumped in with them. So back in the day, if you go back to the 1990s, the first job I had in the disability sector was when I worked for an organisation called RADAR, which was the Association of Disability and Rehabilitation. And something like in 2010 or 2011, 3 organisations got together and formed one organisation, and it was RADAR, the Disability Alliance and the National Centre for Independent Living, and they all became Disability Rights UK. And when I worked for RADAR, the perception among disabled people and the people that I came into contact with every day was that, oh, you're one of those big organisations, you've got tens of millions of pounds, you're doing all this work, how come you're not spending it better doing this, that and the other? And it was always a surprise to them when I said, no, our income is less than £2 million and there's like 15 staff and we all work our socks off. Yeah. And I think Disability Rights UK, you get a lot of the similar kind of stuff because people don't know about the size of your organisation. I think you're not one of those big, massive charities.
Yeah. I mean, we've just taken on one new person, so I couldn't speak on the exact number of us, but from last time I remembered, we're about an organisation of 25, and we're not a massive, charity organisation with that isn't really representative of the group. And we are rather importantly a DPO. We are led by disabled people. We are run by disabled people. Our board are disabled people. And I suppose potentially because of the name being Disability Rights UK, potentially because of our media presence, we can be perceived as not particularly among the DPO group. So we've done some work to sort of reposition ourselves and make, our identity as an organisation quite clear. And I suppose, it's understandable that organisations should be critiqued, and it's something that we're always open to. But yeah, just to make it abundantly clear that we are a DPO. And because of our position really in the sort of political arena, rather than grassroots work, although we do service delivery as well, specifically on things like our advice lines, we have the scope to really sort of bring other DPOs who are our peers along the way in terms of voicing their experiences in policy. A lot of my work now is specifically focused on promoting the rightful expertise of the DPO sector. And it's a space that I didn't anticipate being in, but it's one that it was urged upon me by my peer DPOs, and therefore it's where I am. And it's needed as well. The fact that I have a quarter, a third really of my time specifically dedicated to promoting the DPO sector as experts is a privilege. It's rare amongst other DPOs, so it's something that hopefully will have quite long-term impact for the sector going forward.
And so those are the 4 sectors of your research.
It is, yeah.
Something that happened at the beginning was that you said that you interviewed DPOs, but then you also interviewed 6 non-DPOs.
Yeah, I did.
A question that I've got for you at the end of that sort of discussion about DPOs is, are we a distinct sector? Is the DPO sector a distinct sector, or is it just the voluntary sector? Are the issues the same in the voluntary sector, or do we have specific issues which we're tackling?
It's a really interesting conversation, Theo, and I think we've spoken about this before. So for sure, there is overlap between the experiences of the voluntary sector, of the charity sector in general, but I would argue from my research that we are a distinct identity from our makeup, our history, the way in which we function, and also our design, and the experiences of the members of the DPOs who work here. You know, we're regarded as quite unique in the way in which we function. However, broadly, we are generally just considered externally as members of just the broader charity space. You know, I mentioned earlier the fact that, you know, there isn't a section on the Charity Commission, for example, where you can identify as a DPO. We're all sort of lumped in as charities. And what I would really like this work to do is to sort of distinguish ourselves from the broader space when it comes to bodies and authorities that really sort of define us. We should be defining ourselves. And I think a lot of DPOs are keen on defining themselves outside of spaces and quite different from spaces that don't represent us.
So there we go. That's the work you've been doing. It's not a small bit of work. It's a big bit of work. It's kind of a little bit groundbreaking. You know, there's reports that come out every now and again, but I think you have the real impact and the real chance to make some serious changes, I think, with capacity within the organization to increase the capacity of the DPO sector to better represent ourselves and to raise our voice at a level, like you say. You know, it's quite often frustrating for an organization like ours to think, hang on a minute, someone should be saying this to government. And so it's great to have that as a kind of a conduit, a pathway, so we can say to you, hey, look, this is happening down here, and you can say, well, actually, that's happening everywhere.
Yeah. You know. And I think that the great part is that this work, not in itself, I think this conversation has carried on beforehand. And what I would really like to stress is, as much as this post is new and this project is new, working to better the DPO sector is not a new project that's being taken up. There's been lots of DPOs that have been worked on this before. Thankfully, we're all talking so that I can learn from their wonderful guidance. But the beauty of this is the fact that it is bringing DPOs along the way. It isn't Disability Rights UK sort of being the voice of DPOs. It's more that we have the space to facilitate the vision of DPOs, and so we're allowing, sort of creating the bridges so that DPOs can sort of make the stances on their own, and being driven purely by DPOs is quite important to this work. So Theo, I mentioned before, is sitting on my board, my steering group board, but you're along with, I think, around 9 other DPOs who are sitting along with me and making the decisions here. So I think the unique part of this work is that it isn't me, Rebecca Tayler Edwards, it isn't Disability Rights UK, it is the sort of collective voice of DPOs, and hopefully that will enable it to be quite critical going forward and making sure that we are driven by our unique voices continually.
So what's the long-term vision? What do you think the future looks like? I mean, you know, everyone talks about how what we need to have is we need to have core funding for disabled people's organisations so that we've got a bit more capacity, so we can do that campaigning work that we also need to be doing, and so that we get recognised as being the experts that we are. I mean, what do you see? How do you see that? Do you see that happening?
I think the expertise piece has a lot of scope here. And I'm going to say that from a few conversations that I've had with rather large academic institutions that I won't name. But I'm talking to academic institutions, as I said before, to promote the DPO sector as a very viable career option for young disabled people. And what I found really interesting about this work is the openness and response to quite a fair lobbying campaign that says we should represent our own people, and we should be doing so and recognized for that as experts in the sort of professionalized sense. And the sort of traction behind quite a simple demand that is unwavering is quite impressive. And I think there is a lot of scope for DPOs, granted, if a lot of DPOs are quite sort of succinct in banging the drum of our expertise, which I don't know a single DPO that isn't. There's a lot of room for us to really demand our position as experts. You know, it's happened in other human rights spaces. And so we can benefit from those who work alongside us for progression of human rights. And this sort of, I imagine that the best way forward is to be quite strategic about who we sort of demand this from, and hope that it sort of creates a ripple effect. So academic institutions is one of the areas that I'm targeting, but I'm also targeting, quite importantly, funders and accreditors, in being quite clear on the demand of our expertise and the fact that that should be responded to with tangible products and tangible projects to recognize us financially for our service. But local government is another area that is in the sort of horizons of targeting, and that's not something I will be doing in silo. It's being done with a whole body of political minds, much more intelligent than I am, in targeting local authority and being quite clear in our demands to be recognized for our expertise. So I think that is something that has quite I think a lot of optimism there. And I'd say in the other sense, there's a lot of hope, in my opinion, in sort of bringing along the young disabled people and the movement that they've almost created independently, not knowing that the DPO sector existed, in bringing them along. And I think the demands of today's disability movement is so radical and progressive, it does not waver in its stances. And so I think when we go along together and are quite adamant about our inclusivity, recognition of intersectionality, there's a lot of power and force that we can bring to society. So that's my foresight for the future, but I'm not a futurist.
Right. No, it's very optimistic. So that's a nice thing to hear about. You know, it's a great note to end on, I would say. It's great to have an optimistic view of the future like that.
Yeah, for sure. I think the future can be bright as long as we are quite clear on the fact that we should create it.
Hey, listen, Rebecca, it's been brilliant talking to you. Thank you very much for all of your time. Is there any kind of final thing you'd like to say that we haven't spoken about?
No, nothing from me, Theo. The only thing I would say is just to plug my details for anyone who listens, if that's okay. I'm sure that's all right to put in your sort of bio of the podcast. But if anyone does want to get in contact with me, my email is Rebecca.Tayler, which is spelled ER-Edwards at disabilityrightsuk.org. And you know, just to end on the note that this work is built and designed to be in partnership with disabled people and DPOs. So if any organization really wants to get involved in sort of steering my path, then it is something I'm more than open to. And also critique. I'm very open to different organizations sort of saying, oh, well, this isn't the way in which we think you should be working. We think you should be working more inclusively over here, etc. And I think it's particularly important. So that's my last 2 cents.
Hey, listen, brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, and do contact Rebecca because she is open and willing to listen. Speak to you very soon.
Speak to you later. Thank you, Theo. Bye.
Bye-bye.